When does Jesus not want you to follow him? There's a story in Mark chapter 5 where the disciples and Jesus sail across the Sea of Galilee, and on getting to the shore, they see a strange, terrifying sight. They see a naked man, and he's bleeding. He's got chains all over his arms. He's ranting and raving. Moderns would say that this is probably a mentally ill man, a homeless man. But the text calls him possessed or oppressed by demons. To the great distress of the disciples, this man's at a full sprint coming towards them. Would you be terrified? But to their surprise, he falls to his knees. It says, "Son of the Most High God, don't torture me. Don't torture me." And Jesus turns to the man and says, "What is your name?" And with a more gravelly voice, the man says, "Legion, for we are many. Please don't send us out of the area. Please send us into those pigs." There's a bunch of pigs grazing on the hillside, 2,000 of them. And in a strange story, Jesus allows the demonic forces into the pigs. The pigs fall into the ocean and drown. And the whole town comes out and begs Jesus to leave. "Please get out of here. You're trouble." Jesus and the boys get back in the boat. And the demonized man, makes sense, he wants to come with them. He wants to follow Jesus too. But Jesus says this, as Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. Jesus did not let him, but said, "Go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you, and how he has had mercy on you." We're starting a new series today called God Space. And you've got a booklet and a book in your chair, and we're going to come back to this shortly. I encourage you just to set this aside as I'm teaching, and I mean, unless you get really bored, it's an option, but hopefully it won't be an issue. We'll come back to that in a moment. Our mission as a church, as we've been talking about, is connect, grow, go. Connecting with Jesus, growing together, and going to make disciples. What's a disciple? Someone who follows Jesus, someone who trusts Jesus and obeys him, someone who listens to him. It's someone whose life has been transformed, who exudes right living and selfless joy, love, and peace. The kind of person you want in your neighborhood. Really, a disciple is someone who serves others and shares the good news. If you're taking notes, that's one of the blanks. Someone who serves others and shares the good news. But like we just saw, sometimes this means Jesus does not want us to follow him in the ways that are most comfortable and safe. Sometimes Jesus does not want us to follow him when we think following him means hanging out just with Christians. When we think that it's being comfortable. When we think that following Jesus means isolating from our past and the people who knew us there. When we think following Jesus means leaving our city community or hiding from it. The demonized man wants to follow Jesus in one way, but Jesus says, "I have a different way for you to follow me. Go and tell." Go and tell. At the end of Jesus' life, he stresses this kind of missional living. And I love how each of the 4 eyewitnesses tell it a little differently. We call it the Great Commission, the Great Mandate, the Great Mission. In Matthew, this is the most familiar one probably, Jesus says, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing, teaching them to obey all that I've commanded you." In Mark, he says it like this, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation." In Luke, repentance for the forgiveness of sins will be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. Yes, he's doing third person there. It's always funny when people talk about themselves in third person, right? But my personal favorite is in John, and it took me a while to find it because it's written so differently from the other 3. Jesus says this, "As the Father sent me, now I send you." What does it mean to preach the gospel? It's kind of religious language, but it just simply means to announce good news. And what is the good news? Simply, God loves us, Jesus died for us, and Jesus is king. God loves us, Jesus died for us, and Jesus is now king. All throughout the Bible, God has been on a mission to bring us back into relationship with himself, to make the world right with everything that went wrong in the third page of the Bible, humans doing their own thing. So Jesus then becomes the ultimate missionary, entering into our experience, even dying for us. Now, his followers model their master with our lips and with our lives. You see, the church, Christians, we exist for those outside of these walls. We exist for those who aren't yet here. And we have to constantly resist the drift towards a comfortable, club-like Christianity that forgets our mission. Jesus doesn't suggest missional living. He doesn't encourage it. He commands it of us. He commands his followers to share the good news. No one better understood this than Paul, the missionary. He tells the Corinthian church this in 1 Corinthians 9:16. For when I preach the gospel, I cannot boast, since I'm compelled to preach. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. Notice that word woe, W-O-E, not W-O-A-H. It's a word that means intense hardship, calamity, distress, pain. Paul is reflecting this sense of burden, of obligation from the ancient prophetic tradition. Think of guys like Jeremiah who said something like this: if I say, I will not mention God's word or speak any more in his name, his word is like a fire in my heart, a fire shut up in my bones. I am weary of holding it in. Indeed, I cannot. Then God tells the prophet Ezekiel this. He says, Ezekiel, I have made you a watchman for the people of Israel. So hear the word I speak and give them warning from me. When I say to the wicked, you wicked person, you will surely die, and you do not speak out to dissuade them from their ways, that wicked person will die for their sin, and I will hold you accountable for their blood. But if you do warn the wicked person to turn from their ways, and they do not do so, they will die for their sin, though you yourself will be saved. So God tells Ezekiel, you're like the watchman. You're like the guy who looks out for the enemy coming from a distance, and you got to constantly be awake and vigilant and do your job. Paul feels that same sense of weight and obligation and responsibility that Jeremiah and Ezekiel felt. If he holds it in, if he hides or hinders it, like a boiling pot of water with the lid on, it's eventually going to bubble over if he doesn't share. I guess one of the big differences, though, is Paul's news is good news. Good news to announce. If you have good news, think of an engagement or expecting a baby, getting a dream job, getting into your dream school. You want to share that with everybody. You want to let the whole world know. And Paul, despite beatings and imprisonments, floggings and shipwrecks, he's not deterred from joyfully announcing the message to everyone, the good news of King Jesus. I think Christians today, all of us, need to have this greater sense of obligation and weight, that loving and sharing with our neighbors is not optional. This is something that should be central in our lives in our church. We must live on mission like Jesus told us to. Now, this great sense of obligation can have a downside. If you're anything like me, listening to sermons on evangelism, I often feel a spike in blood pressure. I feel guilty. I feel like I'm not doing enough, like I'm unequipped and inadequate, and I'm a pastor. So, I mean, how many of you kind of have that sense in your lives? A number of us. Maybe we'll make that rhetorical. Right? So, some of this is good. I should be challenged to be less self-focused. I should be reminded of my obligation, really my privilege to share. But I think we haven't always been set up well in the church, knowing how to do this right. And so, let's look at some myths, motivations, and methods of evangelism. Let's unpack a few of these. First, the myths of evangelism. Let's bulldoze a few of these. Okay? The first myth, I can't talk about Jesus because I don't have all the answers. Maybe some of you have felt this way before. I don't have enough information. I'm not an expert. I'm not a pastor. What if they ask a question I don't know the answer to? We have a group Facebook page for the Redwood campus. If you're not on it, feel free to join. But Some people reflected this fear recently and said, what if I don't know what to say? And so many of us feel this way. And by all means, grow. By all means, learn and study. But to start sharing, all you need to know is the answer to one question. What has God done for you? What has God done for you? Think of that demoniac man, the man we read about earlier. How much did he know? How much research had he done? Did he go to seminary? Probably not. Mark 5:20, so the man went away and began to tell in the Decapolis, 10 cities, how much Jesus had done for him. And all the people were amazed. Didn't have very much education, but it didn't matter. And what had Jesus done for him? And there are a lot of other examples. Think of the woman at the well, the leprous Samaritan, these people that Jesus does something for them and they just go tell everybody. And actually not knowing everything might be an asset. For example, newer baby Christians share their faith more than veteran Christians. Interesting. I think too many Christians, experienced Christians, arrogantly act like experts, turning off others as we seem like we know it all. I think humility goes further than knowledge in our relationships. It's disarming to say, you know what? I don't know the answer to that. Let's study it together. That's a great question. It's disarming. It's helpful, I think. Or think of the great story in John chapter 9. The religious leaders, they're just grilling this man who was formerly blind. Jesus healed this blind man, and they have all sorts of theological questions for him. And the man kind of shrugs his shoulders. Guys, I don't know the answer to any of these. But one thing I know, I was blind, and now I see. Hard to argue with that, right? Anyway, it's rare that someone's argued into the faith through pure, rational, intellectual arguments anyway. Another side of the I can't share because I'm not an expert myth is that we think we're responsible for someone else's faith journey. That we're responsible for whether or not that person accepts the good news. But that's not true. We're commanded to share, but at the end of the day, the responsibility for a soft heart is both God's responsibility and that other individual's responsibility, not yours and mine. We just need to share what Jesus has done for us. Myth number 2 is this: evangelism is immoral. This is more for the younger generation. Barna research noted that 47%, nearly half of practicing millennial Christians, said it was wrong to evangelize. Isn't that an interesting statistic? What makes the research conflicted is that 94% of the same people said that becoming a Christian is the best thing someone could do. Isn't that strange? 47% practicing millennial Christians said it was wrong to evangelize. 94% of the same people said the best thing someone could do is become a Christian. There's a disconnect there, right? Now, before we beat up on the millennials, which is some of our favorite pastimes, I think there might be a pendulum swing, a reaction against bad evangelism. Angry street preaching, impersonal conversations, treating people like projects, hitting them over the head with the Bible. You know, that one never works well. But millennials, too, need to see that truth is not relative. That disagreeing with someone doesn't mean you hate them. And that loving evangelism is practical, possible, and necessary. Myth number 3, some people think, I only share Jesus with my actions. It's like that quote, preach the gospel at all times, when necessary, use words. The problem with that is that our actions are not the message. Yes, no doubt our actions are vital to the credibility of the message, but no one will meet Jesus through just actions. The word has to come in at some point. Paul tells us in Romans 10, faith comes from hearing the message, and the message is heard through the word about Christ. See, lots of people live good, compelling, moral lives and aren't Christians. And so as Christians, we need to both live a good life and point to the reason for the hope that we have. Myth number 4, my least favorite myth. Isn't this just the pastor's job? Not mine? Don't we pay Tyler to do this? Shouldn't the pastor tell my friends about Jesus? Each individual Christian is commanded to live on mission. Every one of us individually. Pastors are here to equip you. I'm here to help you on your mission field. This is not my job. This is our job together. Plus, imagine for just a second if I was responsible for sharing the gospel with all your friends, all your family, and all your coworkers. If that's outside Sunday morning, that's impossible. How could I go to all of your various spheres of influences and speak to people? Especially when you are more equipped than I am with your relational capital, with the relationships you've already built in these areas. Well, my favorite myth is kind of the other side of it and does need to be demolished too. This is the congregation's job, not the pastor's. This is the congregation's job, not the pastor's. There's an opposite error from the last one. And this one's just for me and Frank and any other church leaders listening in. Can I let you guys in on a little secret? Sometimes the temptation for pastors is to think that evangelism is your job and not ours. Okay? That I just need to preach. I just equip the saints, brother. Well, they do the work. See, it's really easy for paid pastors to spend all day with just Christians in our offices or whatever. And isn't that crazy? One, it's not being obedient to God. But two, I don't think it's helpful for you. If I tell you guys what you got to go do and how you got to be salt and light in the community and I never go do it, that's very hypocritical. And I love that River Valley does allow me to go coach and not have to keep certain office hours and get to study off campus because it's really important to us. The temptation is very easy for paid pastors to just spend the day with Christians. Well, those are some myths, and there's many more that we could talk about, but let's now move to the motivations. What should motivate us for evangelism? Sadly, motivation in the past has been primarily out of guilt. Like, this is what you need to do. There is that obligation, but guilt is not very effective at motivating people. Neither is accomplishment, like how many notches you get under your belt or whatever. But the best motivations, and Frank's going to talk more about this next week as we talk about the heart, the best motivations are glory for God, love for neighbor, and joy for us. So first, glory for God. See, at the root level, we want God to get more glory and praise and adoration. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Reverenced, honored, glorified be your name in this city. It's the prayer. God, you deserve more and more adoration and accomplishment, acknowledgement, appreciation. You deserve more thankfulness and reverence in this city. You deserve the praise of every person in this city. See, God's glory should be a motivating factor in our conversations, in our prayers. But then love for our neighbor should motivate us. Now, these are people, not projects. That we as Christians believe finding and following Jesus is the best thing for us, the best thing for our neighbors. That we were made for God and find our joy and peace and significance in Him. Love for neighbor compels us. And then I don't think it's wrong to be motivated by joy. See, when I live on mission, when I selflessly live for other people, I'll get joy. When I live for my own pleasure, selfishly, I get miserable. When I pursue God's plan, my neighbor's good, I get joy watching other people experience joy. See, our joy is found in making God joyful and our neighbor joyful in spiritual conversations. It's like when you give a gift to someone at Christmas or something, and you get joy watching them enjoy the gift. I'm looking forward to that message next week. But finally, how about the method? How do we actually do this? How do we go about this task? There are lots of outreach strategies, the good, the bad, and the ugly. But at River Valley, we are going all in this series. We are most passionate about natural, relational, spiritual conversations. Natural, relational, spiritual conversations. This is what our God Space series is all about, creating God's space for these conversations to happen. Or really allowing God to create this space where these spiritual conversations will happen naturally. You do have a book here that we're going to go through as a church by Doug Pollock called God Space. And we're asking for $5 per book. If you have it, just drop it in the offering as that goes by. If you don't, please take the book regardless. And then the God Space question workbook. This is what our life groups will go through. If you are not in the life group, this is your last chance on Sunday to go talk to Renee in the lobby and get plugged in. But if for whatever reason you can't be in a life group this season, you can still go through this with a family member or something or a friend. And I think it's going to be very, very helpful. This God Space journey is a three-pronged approach. We have the weekend service, what we're doing right now. We have the life group where we get to talk through these lessons we've already made. Frank and Tawny did a great job on this. And the third is your personal growth. That's what the book's for. That during the week, you're reading it. These are the kind of books I like. Real short chapters. But I think it's going to be a lot to chew on, a lot to work through. If we could talk all day about these things on Sunday, but if I don't make some gradual steps to implement them on Monday, this might just be theoretical. Like I really want this to be personal, a change in my own heart. So I think doing all three of those things, you'll be most successful in this series. But even if you can only do one or two, I encourage that as well. Our methodology, natural, spiritual conversations. These start by one, developing relationships with those outside the church. And for many of you, this isn't a problem. I look out, I see coaches, I see teachers, I see people involved at school, at public schools. And so that's awesome. Our church in the community, for the community. Many of us have friends outside of church, work, school, neighborhood, sports. And we can always go to a deeper level in these relationships because the temptation's often to keep it surface level. All right, how's the weather? I love your shoes. I hate the Patriots, To never really go to that next level. But some of us still are hanging out with Christians probably too much and to build relationships in these areas. If you're struggling for ideas here, it might involve regular walks through your neighborhood, going to the same coffee stand, the same barista at the same time, gas stations, stores, all that stuff. Meeting the parents of the kids at your school, inviting neighbors over, and we're going to talk a lot more about some of these ideas for building relationships. And then in those relationships, too, we're going to look for natural spiritual conversations. God space. So in these relationships, this God Space series is going to encourage us in anticipating, being ready for, prepared for these conversations. I say natural because these shouldn't be forced or weird. You guys ever had those weird conversations or forced ones? I mean, if your friend comments, yeah, it sure is hot outside, and you go, you know what else is hot? Hell. That's kind of weird. And you're probably not going to have very good conversations with that person. If someone says, I've been hitting the gym 5 days a week, and you do the whole, well, imagine if you did 5 days a week at church. Like, we affectionately call this conversational hijack the Jesus juke. It's not a good move. Natural means there aren't weird jumps from one topic to another, breaking through the wall like the Kool-Aid man. That's not what we want to be about. Instead, natural is organic. Natural means we ask lots of questions. If you get anything from this series, questions, questions, questions. Jesus asked so many questions. That we're asking our friends and neighbors about what they feel, what their hopes and dreams and desires are. Now, natural does not mean unintentional. Because in every conversation, there's always directions. There's options to take it. We could keep it surface level. We could go deep. Or we could change the subject. And, every situation will be different. If your friend or neighbor doesn't want to go deep, don't go deep. But I think more people want to go deep than we think. More people, I think, are hungry for deeper, spiritual, transcendent areas of significance than we think. So after we learn next week about the heart and getting our motivations right, we're going to talk about noticing, serving, listening, wondering, and sharing. That we're going to create God's space by noticing, serving, listening, wondering, sharing. I'm really excited for this series, like I've said. I'm mostly excited for what's going to happen in me, knowing that I need a change, a transformation in this area, and praying for God to bring this about. I'm going to invite the worship team back up. And instead of just transitioning to the next part of the service, I intentionally made my sermon shorter. No amens, okay? I intentionally made this shorter to build in a few moments for prayer, to just quiet our hearts and pray for this series, this next season in our life as a church. And so there's going to be some verses on the screen, and they're going to transition every few moments or so. And I just encourage you to take this time to pray through these verses on the screen. And if you're not really a person of prayer, you're not really that religious, you just decided to join us today, thank you for being here, and just take the moment to relax and just meditate. But the rest of us, let's really focus in on this time, and then we're going to sing a song together. So.